I do not remember when it began, only that it did. I do not remember when it began, only that it did. There was no calendar, no sundial, no rhythm to follow but the aching light and the creeping dark. Days bled into nights, and nights returned again with the same dull familiarity. I walked mostly. I walked to find food, to find warmth, to escape wind, and later, to find something I did not yet know the name for. Company, perhaps. But there was none. Only trees, wind, stones, and the strange silence of a world not yet ready to speak. There were no words yet. That is something I think about often. No words for hunger, though I felt it always. No words for the sky, though I looked at it as if it might answer. The grunts and sighs I made were not language. They were noise. And in the absence of language, thought becomes a kind of wandering, a shapeless thing. Ideas do not form. They drift. They dissolve before they settle. There is no memory in them, just sensation, cold, ache, noise, and cold. It was always cold. Even when the sun burned down onto the land, there was no comfort. The shade brought insects. The light brought thirst. I could never seem to win. My skin cracked and healed and cracked again. My feet bled. There was no shelter but rock and dirt, and the tangled arms of trees that cared nothing for me. I envied animals. They moved with purpose. They had instinct. I had something else. Not quite instinct, not quite reason. Only this strange ache to keep going. I sometimes stared at my hands. They felt foreign, like tools I had not yet learned how to use. Fingers that could grasp but not build. Palms that could strike but not shape. I would sit for hours, watching ants crawl over my knuckles, wondering if they understood the world better than I did. I think they did. They moved in lines. I moved in circles. Everything was a threat. Everything. The wind. The trees that creaked above me at night. The animals that howled in the dark. I learned to crouch. I learned to wait. I learned that fire hurts and water drowns and cliffs fall and teeth tear. I learned by pain. There was no other teacher. And when I finally slept, it was not rest. It was hiding. Sleep was the only place where I did not feel the dull weight of being the first. But even then, dreams came. And they too were empty. Just more walking. More silence. More of the same. Being first was not a triumph. It was not a beginning. It was just a mistake that hadn't yet been corrected. Hunger was the only companion I had that never left. It followed me through the trees, across the plains, into the shallow caves I crawled into at night, always pressing against my ribs like a dull stone, reminding me that I was alive only because I had not yet failed to feed myself, and that was never guaranteed. Because food was not a thing that waited for me. Food was a thing I chased, dug for, clawed at, and often lost. Berries that looked the same could poison or nourish. Roots took hours to unearth with bleeding fingers only to taste like ash or rot. And when I tried to catch the smaller animals, they were faster than I was, cleverer than I expected, vanishing into the underbrush while I sat with empty hands and a mouth that forgot what chewing felt like. and the larger animals were worse, because if I got too close to them I became food, not hunter, and I had no weapons, not yet, just rocks I threw without skill. Sticks that snapped when I tried to swing them, a body that was too slow, too soft, too confused to understand why nothing in the world seemed built for me. I would walk for what felt like hours, maybe days. It was hard to tell time without the sun overhead or shadows to follow. And even when the sun was out, it was not a friend. It brought heat that cooked my skin and dried my mouth and made the air thick and still. I remember licking stones for moisture. I remember trying to chew on bark. I remember the sound of my own stomach, a sound that became a rhythm in my ears, louder than any bird call, louder than the wind, louder than the aching silence of everything else. And sometimes I thought I might eat grass, just to stop the pain, but it turned my belly worse than empty. And I would lie curled near roots, shivering not from cold but from that deep inner hollowness that made my limbs feel heavy and my head light. And always I wondered if I was meant to live like this, if maybe the world had made a mistake, placing a creature like me here, with no fur, no claws, no speed, no pack, just this strange mind that never stopped turning and never brought peace. And still, I walked, always walked. Not towards something but away from the nothing that sat behind me like a shadow, a hunger that was not just of the body but of the soul, if such a thing even existed then. Fire was not a discovery, not at first. It was terror. It was noise and light and death. It came from the sky sometimes, splitting trees open and filling the air with a smell I did not understand, smoke, choking, sharp, making the world blur and spin. The first time I saw it up close I ran, not knowing what it was, only that it moved, that it ate things, that it roared without mouth or eyes, and I thought it was alive. A beast made of color and heat and noise, and maybe it was, maybe everything back then was more alive than me. But eventually I came close again, not out of courage but because I was cold, because the dark was full of sounds I could not name, and the fire, it kept those sounds away. The creatures didn't come close when the fire was near, and I sat at the edge of its light, shivering, watching it move like a spirit dancing on broken wood, and I didn't know how to keep it. I didn't know how to feed it properly. I didn't know it needed dry things, small things, and that if I turned away for too long it would vanish just like that, like it had never been. So I began to follow fire. I followed the storms that made it. I tried to steal it from trees, carrying burning branches and shaking hands, only to drop them when the heat bit me, when smoke made my eyes run, when my skin turned red and blistered, and every time it went out I felt lost, like I had lost a part of myself, but it was not mine. I had not made it. I had only borrowed it from the sky or from the chaos of the world, and it never stayed long. I began to dream about it. Orange eyes in the dark, flickering teeth, warmth that would not last, and it became an obsession, not a tool, not a helper, but a thing I chased, again and again, through rain and mud and bitter wind. And sometimes I would sit where it once was, in the ash and the blackened ground, pressing my hands into the warmth left behind, pretending it was still there, pretending I had not failed again to keep it, and I did not yet know how to make it from nothing, only that it was possible, because it had existed, because it had touched me, because I had seen its hunger, and maybe part of me wanted to become like it, to learn how to burn, how to matter, how to make the world notice that I existed at all. There were no voices but mine, and even mine was not truly a voice, just rough sounds in my throat, groans, hums, the accidental shout when pain surprised me, the drawn-out muttering I made in the dark to fill the silence. But it was not language, it was not talk, because there was no one to listen, and I did not know what it meant to be heard. My mouth moved out of instinct, not intention. Like how birds cry at nothing or wolves howl into the emptiness, I made noise to stop the quiet from crushing me, but it always came back, heavier than before, and I remember once staring into a puddle, seeing my reflection, thinking for a moment that maybe this was another person, someone I could reach, but the face didn't speak, it only copied me. And that was worse than silence. It was mockery. So I smashed the water with my hand and walked away, feeling more alone than before. And the truth is that alone wasn't even the right word, because it implies there is such a thing as with, but I had no memory of others, no proof that they existed, only the sense that something was missing, that something about me didn't work right in this world, that I was shaped for a thing that didn't yet exist. I would see patterns in the dirt, marks in the grass, bent branches, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, something like me had passed that way. But I never found it, not once, and eventually I stopped looking, because hoping made the hunger worse, the ache sharper. And I told myself I didn't need anyone, that my thoughts were enough. But they weren't thoughts, not really, just images, loops of fear, brief flashes of what could be and what wasn't. And I tried to talk to the trees, but they didn't answer, and I shouted at the sky, but it stayed empty. And I whispered to bones I found on the ground, hoping some echo would return, but all I got was the sound of my own breath, tired and thin. And so I walked in silence again, not because I wanted to, but because there was no other sound in the world that cared I existed. And I began to forget what even made a voice matter, what the shape of meaning might feel like. And the worst part was knowing I might never find out. Not knowing was the heaviest thing. Heavier than hunger, heavier than cold, heavier even than fear. Because fear at least had shape. It had teeth and eyes and sound in the dark. But not knowing was a fog that wrapped around everything I did. I didn't know where I was going when I walked. I didn't know if I was supposed to stay or move or build or hide or chase or wait. I didn't know what anything meant, not the stars. Not the rain, not the ache in my bones, not the trembling in my chest when the sky changed color, and worst of all, I didn't know what I was, not really. I had no name, not for myself or for the things around me, and when there is no name there is no understanding, only confusion. And every time I picked up a rock I wondered if I was supposed to do something with it, but I didn't know what. When I saw the bones of animals I wondered if they had once been like me or if I was just another beast who hadn't died yet. I touched my own skin and didn't understand why it was soft, why it hurt so easily. Why my hands could close around things but not make anything stay. And sometimes I would sit for hours staring at my fingers, moving them slowly, like trying to remember something I never learned. And the sky above me was so big, so endlessly big, and full of things I could not reach or even explain. Lights that moved, lights that didn't, clouds that came and went like they had plans. And I didn't. I just wandered, reacting to things, guessing at danger, surviving. Without purpose, and there was no voice in my head saying this is right, this is wrong, just a dull throb of instinct, and even that was broken, because sometimes I would chase a thing and catch it and kill it, and then feel nothing, not relief, not pride, just emptiness again. And I didn't know if it was always going to be like this, or if one day something would change, and that question, that endless, gnawing, unanswerable question was worse than all the wounds and failures and nights spent. Shivering, because it made me feel like a shadow of something not yet real, like I was only the outline of a creature that didn't yet know what it meant to be alive. The days did not mean anything. They came and went without names, without numbers, without direction, one light after another, one dark after another, no beginning, no ending, only the slow erosion of time passing without witness, without reason. I could not count them because there was nothing to count for, no event to mark, no goal to move toward. And even if I tried to remember, they all bled together, the same sky, the same dirt, the same ache in my legs, and sometimes I wondered if I had already lived forever and just couldn't remember the start, because nothing ever felt new, not the places, not the sounds, not even the pain, which had settled in me like a familiar guest, dull and constant. And there was no point in hoping for anything different, because I didn't know what different would feel like. I didn't know what to hope for, what to expect. Only that I kept waking up, and that the waking up itself became a kind of task, a duty that I never chose. I would open my eyes and it would be the same, always the same, light above, dirt below, the air pressing against my skin like a weight, and I would rise because there was no point staying still, and I would walk because there was no shelter that lasted, and I would eat what I could find because hunger did not wait, and then I would do it again, the same thing, every day, without change, without relief, and time itself became a blur. Not a river but a stagnant pool, no ripples, no current, just the thick silence of being trapped in a world that never noticed me, never called me forward, never gave me anything but survival without explanation, and that's what made it so hard. Not just the discomfort, not just the loneliness, but the utter lack of pattern, of meaning, of signal or sign. Nothing told me what I was doing right or wrong. Nothing answered my questions. And slowly I stopped even asking. I stopped thinking of tomorrow as anything different from today. Because it never was. It was always just more sky, more dust, more silence, more of this. I kept moving because standing still meant listening to the silence press harder into my bones. And though my legs ached and the soles of my feet split open and bled against the stones and thorns and rough earth, I walked because the world offered no reason to stay in one place. There were no borders, no shelters, no maps, no paths, just endless open land that stretched in every direction and never promised anything, no safety, no warmth, no knowledge. Just more of the same, wind that shifted without warning, sun that burned without mercy, rain that fell cold and sharp, soaking my skin and chilling me until my teeth clattered in my mouth like stones in a basket, and I thought often of lying down and not getting back up, not because I wanted to die, but because I wanted something to stop, not even the pain, just the repetition, the endless walking, endless hunger, endless wondering if there was anything at all beyond this emptiness. but I never did lie down for long, because the cold would come, or the hunger, or the shadow of a beast, or the memory of a sound I didn't recognize, and so I kept going, over ridges and valleys and across rivers that threatened to carry me away and into forests that whispered but never welcomed. And sometimes I found a place that seemed safer, with soft moss or overhanging stone, and I would curl up in it for a night or two, but the feeling never lasted. Because safety was always temporary, always fragile, always false. The ground would shift, or insects would crawl into my hair and ears, or the sky would open and drown everything, and I'd be forced to move again. And every time I thought I might be learning something, that perhaps this was a test or a game or a puzzle I could solve, I'd be reminded I was alone, completely, utterly alone. And that made everything I thought I was learning feel like guessing, like scratching at a wall in the dark hoping it turns into a door. And even when I found food, even when my belly was full for a night, I felt no joy, no pride, only the brief silence of a need temporarily silenced before it returned stronger than before. And I realized nothing stayed solved. Nothing stayed won, nothing stayed good. Everything had to be repeated, hunted again, searched again, suffered again. And in all of it there was no reward, no sign that I had done well. Only the continuation of the same hard rhythm, the same breath, same aches, same cold. Same longing for something I couldn't name, and I tried to mark time once, with stones, stacking one each day, but they fell over, or I forgot which were old and which were new, and eventually I stopped, because it didn't matter, because what was the point in measuring what never changed? What was the point in counting days that brought nothing new? And sometimes I screamed, not to scare anything away, but because I wanted to hear something human, even if it was my own voice distorted in panic. But the echoes came back wrong, twisted, thin, like the world couldn't even be bothered to echo me properly. And I learned not to expect fairness or meaning. I learned that the world had existed long before me and would continue long after me, and that it did not need me, did not notice me, and would not miss me. And that is what hurt the most, not the wounds or the hunger or the fear, but the fact that I was not necessary, not to anything, not to anyone. And in that understanding I felt something die in me, not my body, but the small strange hope I had carried without knowing it, the hope that maybe this would lead somewhere, that maybe I had been born for something more than wandering and bleeding and shivering and guessing in the dust. And I began to see my own face in puddles again, not as a friend, not even as a stranger, but as a question with no answer. A mistake written in flesh and breath, a shadow pretending to be real, and even then I kept moving, because I did not know how to stop. The cold was not just something that came at night. It lived in the wind. It lived in the soil. It lived beneath my skin and in the pit of my stomach and behind my teeth when I tried to breathe. It was not the kind of cold that could be escaped by walking faster or finding shelter, because there was rarely shelter. And even when I found caves or overhangs or hollows in the roots of trees, the cold would curl up beside me like a second body, breathing against my back, soaking into my bones until my fingers lost their shape and my muscles refused to move the way I needed them to, and I would wrap myself in leaves or dirt or fur I had torn from something already dead. But it was never enough. It only slowed the cold, never stopped it. and the worst part was the silence it brought. Because cold silenced the world, the birds stopped, the insects disappeared, the trees stopped swaying, and the whole earth felt like it was holding its breath. And I was left with the sound of my teeth chattering and the dull pulse of my heart beating too slow. And sometimes I thought the cold might be the real owner of this world, not the beasts, not the sky, but the cold, because it never left. It only paused, and I could not fight it. I could not bite it or hide from it or plead with it. I could only endure it, and that was the part that broke me, not the pain, but the fact that enduring was all there was. There was no victory, no triumph, no fire I could build that stayed lit, because fire needed dry wood and dry hands and calm air, and the world was rarely kind enough to give me all three at once. So I would sit in the dark, curled like an animal, listening to my own body betray me, and I began to dream in the cold, strange dreams, not of warmth but of absence, of floating in a space with no feeling at all. And I thought maybe that was the real peace I was missing, not comfort, but nothingness. A place where hunger and cold and confusion didn't exist, and I feared that place but also wanted it, because every morning I woke up colder than the night before, and I wondered how long before I didn't wake at all, how long before the cold stopped being outside me and became all of me, and I would walk again, numb and tired, not to escape it, but to outrun the sleep it kept trying to give me, and every step felt like I was dragging a dead version of myself behind me, a version that had already stopped, already frozen, and I would look at my own hands and wonder whose they were, these cracked, blue, trembling things that didn't move the way I asked them to, and still I kept walking, because stopping was worse, because stillness was an invitation, and the cold never slept, and I feared it was waiting for me to give up. Hunger was not a feeling anymore, not a sharp stab in the stomach or a pain I could point to. It was the atmosphere I moved through, the filter over every sight, every sound, every thought. It was not just emptiness inside my body, it was emptiness in the world itself, as though the trees were hollow, the rocks dry and useless, the rivers full of water but no relief. Because the ache was not just for food. It was for something to make the hunger stop meaning something, something to break the cycle of find, fail, chew, swallow, still empty. Because I learned that some hungers never end, they just move deeper, they nest inside the chest, inside the bones, they become memory and instinct and dream. And I would dream of meat. Not just meat but warmth, fat, marrow. I would dream of berries bursting with juice and roots that didn't taste like bitterness. And I would wake up chewing nothing, biting my own tongue. And taste blood, and for a moment feel something like satisfaction before the cold came back, before the weakness in my arms reminded me that nothing had been solved, that no meal was ever enough, that no hunt ever left me feeling full, and I tried to eat everything, bark, leaves, insects, bones I cracked open with stones, licking the dust of them in hope of something more. But still the hunger returned, still it waited for me like a shadow, and I began to understand that hunger was older than me, that it had shaped me, shaped my body, my fear, my teeth, my silence. It had shaped how I moved and where I slept and what I dreamed of. And it had no face, no voice, only weight. And I hated it, but I also needed it, because without it there would be no reason to move at all, no reason to try. It was both curse and command. It kept me alive while also learning what life meant, and I would catch small animals, trembling things with eyes too wide and bodies too light, and I would kill them with a stone or my hands or my teeth if I had to, and their blood would coat my fingers, and their bodies would twitch, and I would eat while they were still warm, and still I would feel unsatisfied, not because they weren't enough, but because I wasn't enough. I wasn't built to enjoy it, only to survive it, and even when I found more than I could finish, even when I felt heavy with food, I still feared the next day, because nothing lasted. Nothing ever lasted, and food rotted or escaped or dried too. Nothing, and so the fear of hunger never left, even when my stomach was full, even when I should have been grateful, and I wondered if that fear would ever go away. If anything could quiet the voice inside me that screamed more, more, more even when I had all I could carry. And I knew that the hunger wasn't just in my belly, it was in my mind, it was in my shadow, and maybe it would be there forever. Even if the world gave me everything I needed, because it was never just about food, it was about the missing piece I didn't know how to name. Fire, when I first saw it, was not mine. It was the lightning's child, born from sky rage and dried leaves. It crackled and danced and died before I could touch it, and for a long time I only knew it as something that appeared and vanished without reason, a spirit of heat and chaos that I could not command, only fear and watch from a distance. And it terrified me at first, the way it moved like it had thought, the way it reached for things and destroyed them without warning, and then it fascinated me, because in the blackness of night, in the numb grip of cold that refused to let me sleep, the memory of fire glowed in my mind like something holy, and I began to chase it, to try and birth it from friction, from stone, from anger. I would rub sticks together until my hands bled, bang rocks until my fingers bruised, and whisper to the darkness to give me a spark, and most times it gave me nothing. Only smoke that mocked me or heat that died before it meant anything, and yet I kept trying, because I believed, maybe foolishly, maybe desperately, that fire would change everything, that fire would make the nights warm, the beasts afraid, the food better, the silence less unbearable. But when I finally made it, when the flame caught and grew, tiny and trembling, it felt like I had torn a piece from the sun itself, and I wept without knowing why, not from joy but from the fear that I would lose it again, and I did. Many times, because fire is greedy and cruel and careless. And even when I fed it, it betrayed me, smoke stinging my eyes, flames eating things I did not mean to offer. And when the rains came it vanished, and I had to begin again, over and over, and soon fire became not a miracle but a burden, something that demanded constant attention, constant sacrifice, and it never gave back as much as I hoped. It warmed me, yes, and it scared off creatures I could not fight. But it did not speak to me, it did not comfort me. It only flickered, always flickering, always reminding me how small and temporary it was, and I began to understand that fire was not salvation, only another struggle, another thing to lose, and I hated how much I needed it. How much of my time became about tending it, feeding it, protecting it, and in that need I saw something of myself. Flickering, hungering, dangerous even to what it loved, and I realized that maybe I had not tamed fire at all, maybe it had tamed me, Maybe all I had done was chain myself to a new fear, and when I sat beside it, watching the sparks drift into the dark, I did not feel strong. I felt watched. I felt judged. And I wondered if fire remembered being wild, if it hated the shape I had put it in, just as I hated the shape I had become. And I knew that even fire could not save me from what I was: cold, hungry, lost, alone. And that even its light could not show me a path that wasn't just another circle back to silence and ash. Silence was not empty. It was full of waiting, full of ghosts and questions that I had no language to ask. It stretched over the land like a heavy blanket, pressing down on my ears and heart until I began to wonder if sound was a lie, if all the noises I thought I heard, the rustling leaves, the distant cries, the drip of water, were only tricks of the mind desperate to fill the void, because the truth was that nothing answered me. Nothing spoke back, and the absence of voice was more than loneliness. It was the erasure of presence, a constant reminder that I was the first and only, that I made the noise and then it died with me. And sometimes I tried to speak aloud, not to anyone but myself, to give shape to my fear and confusion, to see if the words would become real if I said them often enough. But the silence swallowed them like water, no echo, no recognition. And I began to feel like a shadow trying to call itself into existence, a flicker in the dark that no one noticed, that no one needed. And I would sit for hours just breathing, listening to the void, and the void would listen back. And it was never angry or kind, only still. And I tried to convince myself that stillness was peace. But it was a peace that ate hope, a peace that pressed down on dreams until they flattened, until I could no longer imagine anything different than this vast, empty, unchanging world. And I wondered if the silence was punishment, or mercy, or simply the way the world was before. Stories and voices and memory. And I realized that being the first human meant being the first question without an answer, the first loneliness without a touch, the first voice lost before it was ever heard. And that was the hardest thing to bear, not the cold or the hunger or the danger, but the knowledge that I was alone in a silence so deep that it seemed to swallow time itself. And so I kept speaking, kept whispering into the void, hoping for a crack, a sign, a something that would say I was not invisible. But the silence only grew heavier, and I became quieter, until the only sound left was my breath and the steady, relentless beating of a heart that knew no company but its own. Time was a concept I had to invent for myself, because nothing else measured the passage of days and nights except the slow turning of the sky, the shifting of stars that I could barely see, and the way my body grew weaker and older even though I could not name the days or count them, and that made every moment feel infinite and meaningless all at once, like walking through a dream where everything repeats but nothing changes. And I tried to mark time by the rising and setting of the sun, by the phases of the moon, by the patterns of the clouds. But they all blurred into each other like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, colors bleeding into shapes that meant nothing. And I realized that without others to share time with, without stories or calendars or names for moments, time was a prison I could not escape, a chain around my mind that kept pulling me backward even as I moved forward. And sometimes I imagined a future where time would matter, where I could say, yesterday, or tomorrow, and know what I meant. but that future felt so distant it might as well be a lie. And so I drifted in the present, tethered only by breath and pain and the slow decay of my body. And I hated time for being both a thief and a tormentor, stealing my strength while forcing me to endure. Forcing me to face the endless repetition of hunger, cold, silence, and fear again and again. And I wondered if time even had a purpose at all, or if it was just a cruel joke played by the world to make sure nothing ever stopped, that the struggle would never end. And I thought about how much easier it would be if time folded in on itself, if I could find a moment to rest that wasn't swallowed by the next moment's suffering. But the sky moved on, the stars kept their slow dance, and I kept walking through a world where time had no mercy and no meaning, just the constant, endless, unbearable presence of now. Being alone wasn't just a fact, it was a force pressing down on every part of me, like the air but heavier, like a shadow that clung to my skin and seeped into my bones, reminding me with every breath that I was the first and only, a single point of life in a vast silence that stretched endlessly in all directions, and that meant no comfort, no familiar face, no hand to hold. No voice to soften the harsh edges of fear or cold or hunger, and I realized that loneliness was not just the absence of others but the presence of something deeper, the absence of belonging, the erasure of connection, the hollow where trust and love might have grown but never could, because there was no one else, only me, and that was both a miracle and a curse, because I was alive. Yes, but to be alive meant to feel every ache, every pain, every terror without relief, without witness, without understanding. And sometimes I would try to talk to the wind or the trees or the stars, whispering my thoughts as if they might answer back, but they never did, only listened in their own indifferent way. And I began to crave the sound of my own voice, not for meaning, not for answers, but simply so I wouldn't be swallowed by silence. And I understood that to be the first human was to be the first prisoner of solitude, trapped in a cell with no walls, no doors, only endless space and the echo of my own thoughts bouncing back at me until I couldn't tell which was real and which was only shadow. And that loneliness became a weight I carried heavier than hunger or cold, a darkness that followed me into every waking moment and every dream, and I hated it but also feared it, because it was all I had. And sometimes I thought that the only way to escape loneliness was to stop existing, to dissolve into the silence that waited patiently for me. But I kept moving, kept breathing, because that was all I could do, move forward alone. One step at a time, carrying the unbearable weight of being the first, the only and the last, for as long as I could. Trust, that fragile and invisible thread that binds souls together, was a concept I could not grasp, not because I was unwilling but because there was no one else to offer or receive it, no other human to share a glance or a touch or a promise. And so I learned that trust had no meaning in a world where I was the sole creature of my kind, where every rustle in the bushes could be a threat and every shadow a predator waiting to pounce. And yet I longed for something to trust, even if it was only the earth beneath my feet or the sky above that never promised safety but was all I had. And I realized that in this lonely expanse, trust was replaced by wariness, by a constant calculation of danger and safety, by an instinct sharpened to its cruelest edge. Because to survive meant to expect betrayal from everything and everyone, even from my own body when it failed or betrayed me, and that made me both cautious and exhausted. Because trust is supposed to ease burdens, but here it was absent. And in its absence the world became a series of threats, a continuous test of my ability to endure and deceive and avoid harm. And so I became silent, not because I chose to be, but because speaking aloud was a risk, because sound could attract the wrong attention, and I learned to watch, to listen, to measure every breath and movement with suspicion, and that suspicion turned into loneliness, and loneliness turned into despair, and despair into numbness, and still I searched for trust like a ghost searching for its own reflection, hoping against hope that maybe one day the silence would break, and maybe another would appear, and maybe then trust would mean something again. But until that day, trust was a word without meaning, a dream without form, a light I could only glimpse in the distance, flickering but never close enough to reach. Fear was the most constant companion, the shadow that never left my side, the silent whisper that haunted every step I took, because in this empty, wild world, fear was the voice that told me to run, to hide, to fight, to survive, but also the voice that reminded me how small and fragile I was, how easily a misstep could mean death, how the unknown stretched endlessly beyond my sight, and I carried fear like a second skin, tight and suffocating, but necessary, because without it I would not have known caution, and without caution I would have been prey instead of predator, though sometimes it felt like neither, just a fragile flicker caught between two storms. And fear was not just about animals or hunger or cold, it was about everything. The silence, the loneliness, the weight of being the first, the uncertainty of what came next, and it made my mind a restless place, spinning possibilities and dangers like a web that caught me and held me captive. And sometimes I wished I could shut fear out completely, drown it in sleep or forgetfulness, but it was always there, sharp and real, a living thing inside me, and it shaped my actions and my thoughts, my dreams and my waking hours, until I wondered if I could tell where I ended and fear began. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the world was still and cold, I would close my eyes and try to imagine a moment without fear. But the moment was empty, hollow, impossible, and so I accepted fear as part of me, a cruel but necessary truth, the endless dance that kept me alive but also kept me trapped, moving forward but never free, always watching, always waiting, always afraid. Fear was the most constant companion, the shadow that never left my side, the silent whisper that haunted every step I took, because in this empty, wild world, fear was the voice that told me to run, to hide, to fight, to survive, but also the voice that reminded me how small and fragile I was, how easily a misstep could mean death, how the unknown stretched endlessly beyond my sight, and I carried fear like a second skin, tight and suffocating, but necessary, because without it I would not have known caution, and without caution I would have been prey instead of predator, though sometimes it felt like neither, just a fragile flicker caught between two storms. And fear was not just about animals or hunger or cold, it was about everything. The silence, the loneliness, the weight of being the first, the uncertainty of what came next, and it made my mind a restless place, spinning possibilities and dangers like a web that caught me and held me captive. And sometimes I wished I could shut fear out completely, drown it in sleep or forgetfulness. But it was always there, sharp and real, a living thing inside me, and it shaped my actions and my thoughts, my dreams and my waking hours, until I wondered if I could tell where I ended and fear began. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the world was still and cold, I would close my eyes and try to imagine a moment without fear. But the moment was empty, hollow, impossible, and so I accepted fear as part of me, a cruel but necessary truth, the endless dance that kept me alive but also kept me trapped, moving forward but never free, always watching, always waiting, always afraid. And the strange thing about fear was that it wasn't just an emotion but a force that shaped everything. How I moved through the brush, how I chose when to eat or sleep, how I listened for the faintest sound and flinched at every shadow. How I learned to read the sky and the wind and the rustle of leaves like a language of threats, and how, even in moments of rare calm, fear simmered beneath the surface, a low hum that never quite went away, and I understood that fear was both my prison and my protector, a harsh teacher who showed me what mattered by threatening to take it all away. And though I hated the way fear ruled me, I also could not imagine living without it. Because fear kept me alive in a world where every mistake could be the last. And so I moved with fear like a dance partner, sometimes leading, sometimes following, but always intertwined, always present, always a reminder that to be the first human was to carry not just life but the unbearable burden of endless, raw, unyielding fear. Fear was the most constant companion, the shadow that never left my side, the silent whisper that haunted every step I took, because in this vast and empty world, fear was the voice that told me to run, to hide, to fight, to survive, but also the voice that reminded me how small and fragile I was, how easily a misstep could mean death, how the unknown stretched endlessly beyond my sight, and how every rustle in the brush, every distant crack, every flicker of movement might be the last thing I ever saw or heard, and I carried fear like a second skin, tight and suffocating but necessary, because without it I would not have known caution, and without caution, I would have been prey instead of predator, though sometimes it felt like either, just a fragile flicker caught between two storms. And fear was not just about animals or hunger or cold, it was about everything. The silence that pressed down like a weight on my chest. The loneliness that gnawed at my mind, the endless uncertainty of what the next moment might bring. And it made my mind a restless place, spinning possibilities and dangers like a tangled web that caught me and held me captive. And sometimes I wished I could shut fear out completely, drown it in sleep or forgetfulness. But it was always there, sharp and real, a living thing inside me, shaping my actions and my thoughts, my dreams and my waking hours, until I wondered if I could tell where I ended and fear began. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the world was still and cold, I would close my eyes and try to imagine a moment without fear, but the moment was empty, hollow, impossible. And so I accepted fear as part of me, a cruel but necessary truth. The endless dance that kept me alive but also kept me trapped, moving forward but never free, always watching, always waiting, always afraid. And the strange thing about fear was that it wasn't just an emotion but a force that shaped everything. How I moved through the brush, how I chose when to eat or sleep, how I listened for the faintest sound and flinched at every shadow, how I learned to read the sky and the wind and the rustle of leaves like a language of threats, and how even in moments of rare calm fear simmered beneath the surface a low hum that never quite went away, and I understood that fear was both my prison and my protector, a harsh teacher who showed me what mattered by threatening to take it all away, and though I hated the way fear ruled me, I also could not imagine living without it, because fear kept me alive in a world where every mistake could be the last. And so I moved with fear like a dance partner, sometimes leading, sometimes following, but always intertwined, always present, always a reminder that to be the first human was to carry not just life, but the unbearable burden of endless, raw, unyielding fear. Hunger was not just a simple pain in the belly. It was a gnawing emptiness that grew louder with every hour, a slow, relentless ache that twisted my insides and sapped my strength until I felt like a hollow shell struggling to keep moving through the wild unknown. And it was worse because there was no certainty of finding anything to eat, no knowledge of what was safe or poisonous, no one to teach me how to hunt or gather. So every decision was a gamble with death, and sometimes I would stare at the strange fruits and plants that grew around me, wondering which ones could sustain me and which would kill me, and the fear of choosing wrong was a weight heavier than hunger itself, because to eat the wrong thing might mean a slow, painful end, and yet the pain of hunger was immediate and fierce, so I often had to risk it, to tear apart strange leaves or roots, or chase after animals too fast or clever for me. And many times hunger turned my mind to desperation, clouding my thoughts and making every shadow a threat, every sound a promise of failure. Until I became a creature driven by a single, brutal need. But even then hunger was not just physical. It was a reminder of how alone I was, how no other could share this burden with me, how every meal was a victory snatched from a world that seemed indifferent to my suffering, and I hated hunger for the weakness it forced on me, the fear it bred, the loneliness it deepened. But I also feared what would come if hunger ever stopped, because survival was a chain of needs and fears, and without hunger, what was left but emptiness? And so I endured hunger as both punishment and proof of life, moving forward in the endless wild, driven by the pain of absence and the faint hope of something more. Cold was not just a temperature. It was a creeping enemy that settled into my bones and refused to leave. A silent killer that wrapped its invisible hands around my body and squeezed tighter with every nightfall. And because I was alone, without shelter or fire or clothing, the cold was a merciless force that tested the limits of my endurance and my sanity. And I learned to dread the coming of darkness not just because it brought fear, but because it brought freezing silence that numbed my fingers and toes and made my breath visible like ghosts escaping my body. And I tried to find ways to keep warm, curling into myself like an animal, using leaves or mud to protect my skin, but it was never enough, and every shiver was a reminder of how vulnerable I was, how fragile, how close to death. And the cold wasn't just physical, it seeped into my thoughts, chilling my mind until hope felt distant and fading. And I realized that to be the first human was to face the cold without mercy or comfort, to fight an invisible battle every night against a force that could end everything without warning. And yet I survived, not because I was strong, but because I refused to surrender to that endless frost, because somewhere deep inside me, a stubborn spark burned against the dark, a faint will to live that kept me moving forward through the cold nights and colder days. And though the cold never left, I learned to carry it as a cruel reminder that survival was a constant struggle, a fragile thread between life and the void, and I hated that struggle but embraced it, because it was all I had. Silence was the loudest thing I ever knew, a vast, empty void that filled the spaces between my breaths and wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. And being the first human meant living in a world where no voices called out to me, no footsteps approached, no laughter or tears echoed through the air, just an endless, heavy quiet that pressed against my ears and made my own heartbeat sound like thunder in the emptiness. And at first, this silence was a strange relief, a peaceful pause between moments of pain and fear. But soon it became unbearable, a constant reminder that I was utterly alone, isolated in a universe that neither saw nor heard me, and I found myself talking to the wind, whispering secrets to the trees, shouting into the void just to hear something back, anything, and yet the silence answered with nothing but stillness. And that stillness became a weight that bent my spirit and twisted my thoughts, making me question my own existence, my own sanity, because, without any response, without any sign that I mattered, I felt like a ghost trapped in a world that had forgotten how to live. And sometimes in the dead hours of the night, when the darkness seemed to swallow everything, I would scream into the silence, not for help but just to break it, to prove to myself that I was still here, still human, still fighting to be seen. And even though no one ever answered, the silence itself became a presence, a force I had to reckon with, the endless screaming absence that shaped every moment of my lonely existence. And I hated that silence with every fiber of my being because it was both my prison and my punishment. The echo of a world that had no place for me yet held me captive nonetheless. Learning was both a necessity and a curse, an endless, exhausting task that fell entirely on my shoulders, because there was no one else to teach me, no one to guide or show the way. No wisdom passed down through words or gestures, only the raw, brutal reality of trial and error, of mistakes that could mean death or injury. And every discovery had to be fought for with blood, sweat, and tears, from understanding which plants could be eaten without poisoning myself to figuring out how to track animals, how to build shelter, how to make fire. A mystery in itself that teased and taunted me until I finally grasped its secret. And the process was slow and painful, a constant battle between curiosity and fear, between hope and despair, because each lesson came with risks and failures, and sometimes the cost was unbearable, yet I had no choice but to push forward, driven by the desperate need to survive. And as I learned, I realized that knowledge was not a gift but a weight, a responsibility that carried with it the awareness of all the dangers lurking in every shadow. And with each new skill I acquired, the world did not become safer, only more complex and demanding. And I began to understand that being the first human was not just about living but about endlessly adapting to a world that had no mercy and no patience, and that this struggle to learn and understand was perhaps the cruelest part of all, because it meant facing the unknown every single day, without comfort, without certainty, without anyone to share the burden. And so I moved forward, always learning, always fighting, a lone student in the harshest classroom imaginable. Loneliness was not merely a feeling but a heavy, physical burden that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs and dulling the sharpness of my mind, because to be the first human was to exist without any company, without a single soul to share a glance or a word or even a fleeting moment of connection, and that absence echoed in every step I took through the vast, uncaring wilderness, where silence was my only companion and the stars above watched coldly as I stumbled forward. And in that crushing isolation, I found myself longing not just for others but for anything that might break the endless solitude. A bird's song, the rustle of leaves, the flicker of firelight. But such small comforts were fleeting and rare, and more often the loneliness wrapped around me like a shroud, dark and suffocating, a reminder that I was utterly, painfully alone. A solitary being trying to carve existence from a world that neither welcomed nor acknowledged me, and in that loneliness, my thoughts turned inward, spiraling into doubts and fears that multiplied in the absence of other voices, until sometimes I questioned whether I was real or merely a phantom trapped between worlds. And the weight of that loneliness was not just emotional but existential, a burden that threatened to break me, and yet I endured, driven by a stubborn will to survive and a faint hope that maybe, someday, I would no longer be alone, that this unbearable silence might be broken by the presence of another, and until that day, I carried loneliness like a wound that never healed, a silent scream beneath my skin. Loneliness was not merely a feeling but a heavy, physical burden that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs and dulling the sharpness of my mind, because to be the first human was to exist without any company, without a single soul to share a glance or a word or even a fleeting moment of connection. And that absence echoed in every step I took through the vast, uncaring wilderness, where silence was my only companion and the stars above watched coldly as I stumbled forward. And in that crushing isolation, I found myself longing not just for others but for anything that might break the endless solitude. A bird's song, the rustle of leaves, the flicker of firelight. But such small comforts were fleeting and rare, and more often the loneliness wrapped around me like a shroud, dark and suffocating, a reminder that I was utterly, painfully alone. A solitary being trying to carve existence from a world that neither welcomed nor acknowledged me, and in that loneliness, my thoughts turned inward, spiraling into doubts and fears that multiplied in the absence of other voices, until sometimes I questioned whether I was real or merely a phantom trapped between worlds. And the weight of that loneliness was not just emotional but existential, a burden that threatened to break me, and yet I endured, driven by a stubborn will to survive and a faint hope that maybe, someday, I would no longer be alone, that this unbearable silence might be broken by the presence of another, and until that day, I carried loneliness like a wound that never healed, a silent scream beneath my skin, a gnawing emptiness that made every step feel heavier, every breath more labored, and sometimes when the night pressed in close and the cold seeped into my bones, I would lie awake staring at the dark sky, tracing invisible patterns between the stars, imagining shapes that might be faces, voices, lives beyond my own, desperate for even the faintest sign that I was not the last, the only, the final lonely creature lost in the vastness of a world that had no place for me, and that thought, the possibility that I was truly alone, crushed me more than hunger or cold or fear ever could. Because it meant not just death but oblivion, a meaningless existence without echo or legacy. And yet, in that crushing weight of loneliness, in that unbearable silence, I also found a strange kind of strength, a raw and stubborn fire that refused to be extinguished, a will to keep moving forward, to keep searching, even if what I sought was nothing but the faintest whisper of company in an endless void. The unknown was not just a concept but a living, breathing terror that shadowed every moment of my existence, a vast and impenetrable darkness that swallowed certainty and replaced it with endless questions and paralyzing doubt. And to be the first human was to live without maps, without stories, without anything to guide me through the endless mysteries of the world. So every step forward was a plunge into chaos, a gamble with fate that could end in discovery or destruction, and I learned quickly that the unknown was not something that could be tamed or controlled, but something to be feared and respected, a force that held the power to destroy without warning or mercy. And sometimes I would stand at the edge of unfamiliar territory, heart pounding, muscles tensed, eyes wide, trying to read the silence, the shadows, the very air itself for signs of danger. But more often there was nothing but the eerie stillness that made my skin crawl and my mind race with worst-case scenarios. And this fear of the unknown shaped every decision I made, from which path to take to when to rest to how to protect myself. And it was exhausting, a constant drain on my strength and will, because the unknown never went away, never lost its grip. And even in moments of false security, I could feel it lurking just beyond the edge of vision, waiting to pounce, and this relentless fear kept me alert but also isolated. Because no one else shared it with me, no one else could understand the depth of dread that came from facing a world so vast and empty, so full of hidden threats and silent dangers. And though I hated the fear, I could not deny that it kept me alive, a cruel but necessary companion on the lonely, endless road of the first human. Living as the first human meant grappling not just with the physical world but with a profound, haunting solitude that extended to even the most basic reflections of oneself. There were no other faces to compare with, no mirrors crafted from polished stones or still waters to catch an image. The only reflection was in the ripples of the water or the shifting shadows on the rocks, distorted and fleeting, and these became strange companions in their own right, forcing me to confront my own existence in the most raw, unsettling ways. Looking into the water's surface, I saw a figure that was both me and not me, an ever-changing mask shaped by light and movement, fleeting and insubstantial. I longed for recognition, for a sign that I was real, that my existence had meaning beyond mere survival. Without others to affirm my identity, my sense of self became a fragile construct, built on solitude and uncertainty. Sometimes I wondered if I was even human in the fullest sense, or merely a shadow wandering a silent world. This lack of reflection extended beyond the physical. There was no social mirror to understand who I was. No shared stories or collective memory to shape my identity. I was alone in every sense, isolated in a void where self-awareness was both a blessing and a curse. The solitude was overwhelming, a weight that pressed into my mind and soul, yet in that space I found a strange clarity, a forced introspection that shaped me into something new, even if that something was born from loneliness and silence. The world stretched out endlessly in every direction, an overwhelming expanse that seemed to mock my smallness and insignificance. As the first human, I faced a reality where every horizon was unknown, every step forward a venture into the vast, indifferent wilderness that cared nothing for my survival or my existence. Mountains loomed like ancient giants, rivers roared with unstoppable force, forests whispered secrets I could not understand, and skies arced high above, vast and empty, their stars cold and distant. The sheer scale of the world crushed any illusions of control or safety, reminding me constantly of how tiny and fragile I was amidst such grandeur. There were no maps, no landmarks with meaning, only an endless sea of trees, rocks, and sky that swallowed me whole. This vastness bred a deep and gnawing fear, not just of what lay beyond sight, but of being lost, of wandering endlessly without hope of return. Sometimes, in moments of exhaustion or despair, I would sit still and let the enormity wash over me, feeling like a grain of sand caught in a storm, powerless and alone. Yet this vastness also inspired a strange kind of awe, a quiet reverence for the raw, untamed world that was both my prison and my home. To be the first human was to live constantly between fear and wonder, dwarfed by the immense wilderness yet driven to explore it, a lone spark flickering against an endless night. Hunger and thirst were ceaseless tormentors, gnawing at me from the inside out, never allowing a moment of peace or rest, because being the first human meant having no pantry, no storehouse of food or clean water, only the raw, brutal necessity to seek and consume whatever the unforgiving earth offered. My stomach churned with emptiness, twisting and knotting with desperate need, and my throat burned with the dryness of endless wandering under the merciless sun or bitter cold. Each day was a battle against these cravings, and each meal was a gamble. Sometimes the bitter leaves or strange roots I dared to eat caused sickness. Sometimes the water I drank brought sickness. And sometimes there was nothing to eat at all. This hunger was not just a physical pain but a mental weight, sapping my strength, clouding my thoughts, and sharpening my fears. I could not rest while hunger clawed at me, and sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, haunted by dreams of food and water I might never find again. Despite the constant threat of starvation and dehydration, I learned to track signs, where the birds flew, where the plants grew, where the soil was damp, and slowly, painfully, I understood the rhythms of the land that could sustain me, if only barely. But even when food was found, it was never enough to silence the relentless ache inside, a reminder that survival was not a state but a fragile, ongoing fight, and the hunger was an endless companion on the lonely path of the first human. Time stretched endlessly, dragging itself out like a slow, suffocating shadow that engulfed every moment of my existence. And to be the first human was to live without calendars, without clocks, without any markers to measure the passing days, only the shifting light of the sun and the slow dance of the stars above to hint at the relentless flow of hours and seasons, and this endless waiting was a torment unlike any other. There were moments when I moved quickly, driven by hunger, fear, or discovery, but more often I was forced into stillness, waiting for fruit to ripen, waiting for wounds to heal, waiting for the sun to rise or the storm to pass. And in these long stretches of waiting, the burden of time became unbearable. The days blurred together, each one a mirror of the last, and the weight of monotony crushed my spirit as I counted invisible seconds in a world that offered no relief or distraction. The waiting bred impatience and despair, a gnawing sense of futility that whispered that perhaps nothing would change, that perhaps my existence was an endless loop of suffering and survival with no purpose or end. Yet waiting also became a form of endurance, a test of patience and will, and in those quiet moments, I learned to observe the world with a slow, painful attentiveness, noticing small changes, a shift in the wind, the cry of a distant animal, the slow march of clouds, that hinted at life beyond my immediate grasp, and even in the crushing monotony, a faint hope flickered that time might eventually bring change, might eventually bring company, might eventually bring an end to the unbearable loneliness of being the first human on Earth. Silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, oppressive force that filled the vast emptiness around me and seeped deep into my bones, a constant reminder that I was utterly alone in a world that spoke only in whispers of the wind, the crackling of dry leaves, or the distant calls of wild creatures that could just as easily become threats as companions. This silence was deafening in its persistence, wrapping around me like a thick fog that dulled my senses and stretched time into an endless void, where every heartbeat sounded unnaturally loud and every breath was a fragile claim to existence. Without voices to hear, without laughter, without the simple comfort of human noise, the silence gnawed at my mind, stirring shadows of doubt and fear, making every rustle in the brush a potential danger, and every nightfall a plunge into the abyss of nothingness. I longed for a break in the quiet, for the sound of a friendly presence, for any sign that I was not simply a solitary echo in an empty world. But such sounds never came, and the silence endured, a vast and unyielding ocean in which I was a lonely island. In this silence, I spoke to myself, whispered words that had no listener, created stories and memories that lived only in my mind, a desperate attempt to fill the void, to resist the crushing emptiness. But the silence was relentless, indifferent to my struggle, and being the first human meant living in this oppressive stillness, learning to carry it with me, to survive despite it, and sometimes, just to endure was victory enough. In the vast emptiness of existence as the first human, the struggle to find meaning was a silent, unending battle that raged within the confines of my mind, for survival alone was not enough to stave off the creeping despair that came from feeling like an isolated speck in an uncaring universe. Without others to share thoughts or dreams, without stories to pass down or rituals to give shape to life's chaos, meaning became a fragile construct built on tiny, fleeting moments. A sunrise breaking the darkness, the taste of a rare fruit, the warmth of a fire against the cold. But these were mere flickers, never enough to fully banish the gnawing emptiness. I searched for signs, for purpose, for any reason why I existed in this raw, brutal world, and often found only silence and response, a void where answers should have been. The stars above offered no guidance, the earth beneath no comfort, and the endless wilderness seemed indifferent to my presence. Sometimes I wondered if meaning was something only born from connection, from community, and if so, then perhaps I was doomed to wander without it, a solitary figure adrift with nothing but my own thoughts to anchor me. Yet, even in this overwhelming void, I fought to create purpose from the chaos, to mark my passage with small victories and acts of survival, because to give up on meaning was to give up on life itself, and so I held on to hope, fragile and flickering, that someday, somehow, meaning would emerge from the silence, and my existence would no longer be a pointless struggle but a chapter in a larger story yet to be written. Fear was a constant, unwelcome companion, wrapping itself around every thought and movement with icy fingers that chilled me to the core. For being the first human meant living in a world full of unseen dangers, where every shadow could conceal a predator, every rustle in the underbrush a threat waiting to strike. The fear was not just of physical harm but of the unknown itself, the unseen, the unheard, the unpredictable forces of nature that could crush me without warning. This fear sharpened my senses and honed my instincts, forcing me to be vigilant every moment, yet it also wore me down, a relentless pressure that pressed against my mind like an unyielding weight. Sometimes it overwhelmed me in waves, drowning reason and hope beneath tides of panic and despair. And in those moments I was a fragile, trembling creature, vulnerable and exposed. Yet fear also taught me caution, respect, and survival. It was a cruel teacher but a necessary one, shaping my every action and decision. I learned to listen to the silence, to read the subtle signs of the earth, to move carefully and avoid unnecessary risks. Because in this raw, unforgiving world, a single mistake could mean the end. The ceaseless battle against fear defined my existence as the first human, a shadow cast over every step, a fire that both consumed and protected, an inescapable part of the lonely journey through a hostile wilderness. Finding shelter was not simply a matter of comfort but a desperate, ongoing struggle for survival against the relentless forces of nature, because being the first human meant having no built homes, no tools beyond bare hands and instinct, and no knowledge of how to create a safe haven from storms, cold nights, or lurking predators. Each day I scanned the horizon for caves, overhangs, or dense thickets that could shield me from the biting wind or heavy rain, and each night I lay awake shivering under a thin layer of leaves, listening to the howling of unseen creatures and praying that the fragile refuge I found would hold against the fury of the earth. Sometimes the shelter was nothing more than a hollow in a tree or a cluster of branches woven together by chance, barely enough to keep the cold at bay or the rain from soaking through. But it was all I had, and I guarded it fiercely. The constant search for shelter was exhausting and filled with disappointment, as many places that seemed promising proved unsafe or fleeting, forcing me to move again and again, chasing a fragile hope of safety that remained just out of reach. This quest shaped my days and nights, defining my movements and choices. And though I never mastered the art of shelter building, I grew attuned to the land's natural refuges and learned to read the subtle signs of a safe place. Even so, the vulnerability of having no true home was a constant source of anxiety and fear, a reminder that as the first human, I was exposed and unprotected, caught in an endless cycle of seeking and fleeing, forever on the edge of disaster.